An unfailing stimulation for his genius. These great Reformation chorales were not meant to create a mood, but to convey a message. They were a confession of faith in scriptures, not simply personal feelings. Bach's first composition was a simple exercise on a hymn tune, and at the end of his life, he was still at work on a chorale, "Before Thy Throne I Now Appear." Bach's ideal was both unity and diversity. His desire was to create unity with diversity in whatever he produced. And he found ways to tie together even the separate parts of a collection, most often by use of a familiar hymn tune. His organ style was calculated to stimulate devotional feeling, and nowhere more so than the organ Buchlein. This wonderful little booklet for the organ, we feel the like quality of his music. On the title page, Bach wrote, "To the glory of God alone in the highest, and to further the learning of everyone." While in Weimar, Bach became interested in Italian music, especially that of Corelli and Vivaldi. His cousin, Walther, introduced him to the newest Italian music. He learned musical architecture from the Italians. The Bach style really is a fusion of Italian and German characteristics. A man of strong opinions, Bach often had squabbles with those for whom he worked. Most often he was right, but many of the struggles and hardships he had only drove him closer to his Lord. For example, when he was offered a better position in another city, the Prince of Weimar put Bach in prison for a month in order to keep him from leaving. Always an overcomer, an incredibly hard worker, Bach used the time to work on his organ Buchlein.
Why are you videoing?
Temperate, industrious, devout, Bach was a home lover and a family man. He was genuine, hospitable, and jovial. Frugality and discipline ruled in the Bach home. But there was also unity, laughter, loyalty, and love. Bach was a very disciplined person who made the most of all the events, good and bad, in his life. In 1717, Bach left Weimar and became the court conductor to the Prince of Cothen. These years are known as the secular period of his life because of the death of music in the Calvinist Reformed Church with control of the Calvinists, who believed that artistic music had no place in the church, and it was not right for an artist to depict biblical scenes. But Bach, who never shrank from the impossible, was not deterred. Even though we speak of this as his secular period, Bach did not shed his religion when he composed for secular purposes or for instruction. He did not write cheap or trivial works. He believed that the primary reason for music should be for the glory of God and for the recreation of the mind. In Cothen, he wrote his central instrumental works, including Well-Tempered Clavier, which means tempered, well, it means tuned. It revolutionized the tuning of instruments and is one of the most amazing works ever written. Along with Bach's other music, it had an enormous influence on such composers as Mozart, Beethoven, Mendelssohn, Chopin, Schumann, Brahms, and Hindemith. No composer had an inventive faculty as profound and as rich as Bach. He had been rightly spoken of as a composer for all seasons. In 1720, when Bach returned from a musical tour with the Prince, he was met at the door of his home with the shocking news that his wife had died and was already buried. His faith sustained him in this black hour. Later, he married a soprano, Anna Magdalena, who was a superb helpmate to him, both caring for the house and their children, and also in his work. She helped copy many of his manuscripts. For a beautiful soprano voice, Bach wrote many of his most inspired arias. In all, Bach had 20 children. of whom 10 died in childbirth. The youngest, Johann Christian, later became the famous English Bach composer. From the music book Bach wrote for his wife, Anna Magdalena, he used a saraband melody for his Goldberg variations. These were written for a wealthy man who suffered from insomnia. On the nights when he could not sleep, the gentleman would say to Bach's pupil, "Dear Goldberg, play me one of my variations." Everything Bach touched, he improved. He did not invent anything new, but it was the way he brought his many musical ideas together that made his music so rich. Many critics consider Bach the greatest of all composers. In him we have a supreme uniting of a person's faith and his talent. Cellist Pablo Casals, who at 93 began his day by playing from the well-tempered clavier on the piano, said, "There's always something left to discover in it." Helmut Walke, the blind German organist, added, "Ultimately, Bach opens a vista to the universe. After experiencing him, people feel there is meaning to life after all." The fusion of national styles in the unique Bach style is one of the most remarkable qualities of his music. This merging of Italian, French, and German styles is most fully exemplified in his 6 Brandenburg concertos. They continue the coloristic tradition of Venice and of Vivaldi's concertos. The wealth of counterpoint and variety of instrumental color make these concertos unique in this form. Bach loved the recorder and used it in the concertos. He felt that its pure sound carried the soul's devotion to the throne of God. There's always a sense of direction in Bach's music. Even when it wanders, there's always a place of return and resolution. After the years in Cologne, Bach went to Leipzig in 1723. His crowning years of creativity were spent as cantor at the St. Thomas Church there. It was here that he wrote a vast amount of vocal music, including the heart of his work, the cantatas. Of nearly 300 cantatas he composed, only about 200 survive today. Stravinsky once said that Bach cantatas should be the heart of every musician's study. The cantatas join the Bible, music, history into a unified whole. The same thing Rembrandt did in his etchings and paintings, expressing scriptural truth by means of great art. Bach stressed the words and message of in his cantatas. One could do an entire study listening to passages that illustrate this. The same literalness that can be observed in the 15 woodcuts of the book of Revelation, early masterpieces of the great Dürer. Bach, in a sense, placed himself in the pulpit to expound the gospel, and his cantatas reflect the depth of Christian truth. Bach wrote his music as an act of worship in the true mystical sense, and his faith and music are unified. Along with crystalline logic, underlying all of Bach's works are the rhythms controlled but seemingly spontaneous harmonic modulations. One explanation as to why the music of Bach is so popular today among young listeners is its living pulse. Pianist Glenn Gould said, "There's a bridge between Bach's ideas of rhythm and those of the mid-20th century, and has been created by popular music and jazz." That may or may not be true, but what eventually captivates the young listeners, according to a Time editorial, is Bach's granite solidity that young people seem to respond to. It is as if he provided a firm ground base for their improvisatory lifestyle. We can say, as fellow believers with Bach, that there is no as if about it. Firm base Johann Sebastian Bach has given to the world is Christianity. Cantata number 21, I Was in Much Tribulation, is in two sections. Part 1 depicts sorrow and distress of a sinful world. Part 2 describes the spirit of rejoicing in salvation brought by Jesus Christ. Bach also includes in this cantata one of his favorite hymns, If Thou But Suffer God to Guide Thee. The final chorus of this cantata begins with the setting of the words, Worthy is the Lamb that was slain, which is strikingly similar to Handel's setting of the same text in the Messiah. Bach longed to know Handel, whom he greatly admired, but they never met. Bach traveled in a small radius within Germany, whereas Handel enjoyed international fame. For years, I've been giving Farrell House lectures at the Bree Fellowship. The first one I ever gave was on Bach cantatas. This was before chapel. We had meetings in the living room at the Chalet Les Mireilles. After our neighbor and dear friend Herr Lingecker built our chapel, one of the first duets a friend and I performed was Hasten to Jesus from Cantata 78. As D.F. Tubby says, Bach's heaven always rests on a very solid foundation. That foundation is Jesus Christ, truly God and truly man. The culminations of Bach's work as church musicians work as a church musician was his St. John's Passion and St. Matthew's Passion. Often he wrote on manuscripts, with the help of Jesus, or to God alone be the glory, acknowledging that his gift of music was from God. The St. Matthew Passion was considered one of the richest and noblest sacred works in existence. It is the creation of a mind intricately familiar and profoundly moved by a gospel text. And indeed is one of civilization's incomparable masterpieces, and yet it was produced in a tense atmosphere of unfriendliness. One critic said Bach's move to Leipzig was a monumental miscalculation. It's true the salary and social status were lower than before. Also true he entered into fresh difficulties with church officials and choir boys. God's overall plan for his life, not a mistake. It's certain that Bach would not have written as much and as well and pioneered almost every field of music if the last years had been famous and financially free to travel. Bach in his old age did have one exciting triumph. He was invited to the court at Potsdam. What?
I just went like that and made a phone noise.
Still recording. Still recording. Okay.
Bach.
Go ahead. Bach.
That was so weird.
Okay. Bach in his old age did have one exciting triumph. He was invited to the court of Potsdam to play for King Frederick in the Great Prussia, King Frederick the Great of Prussia. He was a gifted amateur musician. Upon arrival, the king dismissed everyone else exclaiming, "Old Bach is here!" It was a memorable evening for the two men, with the musician delighting the king by improvising a fugue on one of Frederick's themes. Not too long after the court visit, Bach's eyes began to fail. After 2 operations which weakened him further, he died at 65, totally blind. While Bach lay upon his bed shortly before his death, he dedicated his last composition, the chorale, "Before Thy Throne I Now Appear." Bach was mourned by many after his death, but only as a brilliant organist and teacher. Exactly 100 years after the first performance of St. Matthew's Passion, Mendelssohn, at age 20, resurrected it. The 1829 performance was received with enthusiasm and awe. Mendelssohn helped establish Bach's place in the musical world, but in all likelihood, no other age than our own has better appreciated the true nature of Bach's wide-ranging giftedness. We benefited today The research done by the eminent musicologists who have brought the works of Bach into clearer focus, and the advent of records has created a vast new audience for Bach by making available countless Bach albums. According to the Bach work Verzeichnis, Bach wrote more than 1,000 works, of which nearly 3/4 were intended to be performed at Christian worship services. Bach's influence in music history has been one of wholesomeness and strength. He is difficult to perform, but he never wrote empty virtuosity. His music has content. Another of his sublime works, the B minor Mass, with its monumental choruses, was written for the Church Universal with thoroughly Protestant spirit. Bach considered the German Mass, as arranged by Luther, as a memorial, not as a sacrifice, The B minor Mass has only one companion, and that is Handel's Messiah. The aim of both creations is the artistic presentation of the essence of Christianity. Handel, writing from the historical viewpoint, and Bach from the doctrinal. Bach, a true mystic in proper biblical sense, lived his life to the fullest, yet he understood that our days upon this earth are numbered. In Come Sweet Death, he expresses the height and depth of his faith. Biographer Alfred Epstein says, it can be fairly said that no composer thought more about death or stood in greater awe of it than Bach. Bach welcomed death, although he feared it. And between his fear and his longing stood only an indomitable and rock-like faith. Johann Sebastian Bach was one of the spiritually wisest musicians the world has ever known. Martin Luther not only chose to stand for the truth of Scripture, but he surrounded himself with artists, poets, musicians, philosophers, and theologians. As a result, the Reformation reached into every realm of culture. Few in our age have even dreamed of, let alone fulfilled, such possibilities based on a clear understanding of Christianity the way Bach, Schultz, Handel, Dürer, Rembrandt, and Milton did. As Machen said, the vast majority of those who reject the gospel do so simply because they know nothing about it. But whence comes this indifference? It is due to the intellectual atmosphere in which men are living. The modern world is dominated by ideas which ignore the gospel. Modern culture is not altogether opposed to the gospel, but it is out of all connection with it. It not only prevents the acceptance of Christianity, it prevents Christianity from getting a hearing. As will be often expressed in these pages, we need to go back in order to go forward. Listen to Bach, appreciate the richness and diversity of music, but hear his message too.
Thank you.